In The Origin of Species, Darwin provided abundant evidence that life on Earth has evolved over time, and he proposed natural selection as the primary mechanism for that change. He observed that individuals differ in their inherited traits and that selection acts on such differences, leading to evolutionary change. Although Darwin realized that variation in heritable traits is a prerequisite for evolution, he did not know precisely how organisms pass heritable traits to their offspring. Just a few years after Darwin published The Origin of Species, Gregor Mendel wrote a groundbreaking paper on inheritance in pea plants. In that paper, Mendel proposed a model of inheritance in which organisms transmit discrete heritable units, now called genes, to their offspring. Although Darwin did not know about genes, Mendel's paper set the stage for understanding the genetic differences on which evolution is based. Now, the study of biology is responsible for some of the most profound insights that humans have about the world around them. So, take a look at these four panoramas. In the upper left, you see some bacteria. This happen to be equal line. You obviously see a butterfly, a flower, a dolphin. If you see that at the outer space, just looks these different forms and structures. You have no idea that they were all related to one to another. So one of the most profound thing that biology told us is that all life on the earth is exceptionally related, similar to one to another. So, for example, all of these life forms rely on DNA and RNA for storing and transmitting and using their genetic and inherited information. They are all based on cells. Cell is the fundamental building block of all life. All of these organisms consist of cells, and the cells essentially have the same chemicals inside of them: carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and the whole bunch of other stuff in much smaller amount. All these organisms conducted metabolism, in other words, chemical reactions that using convert energy from one to the other. And basic chemistry is all very similar to one and another. The type of molecule is used very similar to one and another. Paper mills had the worst of it for years as newspapers reduced pagination, went wholly digital, or shut for good. The papers were able to hammer down the cost of newsprint from firms fighting for business as demand declined. Price-taking paper mills suffered in silence. Many hesitated to shut massive machines costing hundreds of millions of dollars. That hesitance has disappeared. Mills are taking out newsprint capacity and diversifying. Norske Skog, a Norwegian pulp and paper firm, said in June it would close its 66-year-old Tasman mill in New Zealand, for example. Many mills are converting machines to make packaging for e-commerce. UPM, a Finnish firm, announced this year the sale of its Shotton newsprint mill in Wales to a Turkish maker of containerboard and packaging. For JCS Volga, a Russian mill, newsprint used to account for 70% of production. Now half of what it makes is packaging. Two decades ago, Kashmiri houseboat owners rubbed their hands every spring at the prospect of the annual influx of tourists. From May to October, the hyacinth-choked waters of Dal Lake saw flotillas of vividly painted shikaras carrying Indian families, boho Westerners, young travelers, and wide-eyed Japanese. Carpet sellers honed their skills, as did purveyors of anything remotely embroidered, while the houseboats, initiated by the British Raj, provided unusual accommodation. Then, in 1989, separatist and Islamist militancy attacked and everything changed. Hindus and countless Kashmiri businesspeople bolted, at least 35,000 people were killed in a decade, the lake stagnated, and the houseboats rotted. Any foreigners venturing their lives, proved in 1995 when 5 young Europeans were kidnapped and murdered. So between 4000 and 3000 BC, the Mesopotamian Sumerian cultures do not practice any kind of burial. And then, about 3000, in the early dynastic period, these burials start to reappear, and they reappear with a certain amount of conspicuous consumption, and this is the context for the royal burials at Ur. Okay, so the royal cemetery consists of quite a number of pits, so these are the excavation workers who are coming down into the pits. So you get some sense of how really deep and how really difficult it was to construct these chambers. The thing that makes it difficult is because even if life had evolved on Mars, the chances of being preserved are very small. If we use Earth as a reference, and our planet is teeming with life, yet it rarely preserves evidence of life of the fossil record. And the focus now is on exploring for habitable environments. If you're looking for water, a source of energy, either solar energy or thermal energy or chemical energy, and then organic carbon, assuming life as we know it on Earth based on carbon. So those are sort of the 3 things that we're looking for in the course of our mission. Always try to best understand your partner's specific communication styles. A lot of times we'll take it personally if we notice someone's avoiding us or they're communicating with us less frequently than we'd like, and this doesn't mean that they don't care about you or they don't respect you. This is likely how they were modeled communication as a child. Your partner's communication style typically comes from how their caregivers communicated with each other. You should feel comfortable asking your partner, how do you best handle conflict? Also, some people struggle with verbal communication, so if that's the case, you may want to ask your partner to write down what they're feeling. And this way they won't feel so overwhelmed. Finally, know that communication requires compromise. So if you have a completely different communication style from your partner, know that it's going to be a work in progress until you figure out how you're both best going to communicate. There's growing alarm over plunging insect populations with climate change, habitat destruction, and pesticides, all thought to play a role. But now, scientists say there's another culprit: artificial streetlights. Researchers from the charity Butterfly Conservation counted caterpillars at the sides of brightly lit roads. Compared with similar stretches of unlit roads, caterpillar numbers were reduced by half, suggesting streetlights can affect the abundance of insects, at least on a local scale. The scientists say with insects in trouble, we should be doing all we can to reduce negative influences. But there are practical solutions such as dimming streetlights in the early hours, installing motion sensors, or using color filters to modify the light. Research suggests that some are more susceptible than others, especially those who are self-conscious, anxious, and afraid of being judged negatively by others. So, how can we avoid choking when it really counts? First, it helps to practice under stressful conditions. In a study on expert dart players, researchers found that those who hadn't practiced under stress performed worse when anxious compared to those who had become accustomed to pressure. Secondly, many performers extol the virtues of a pre-performance routine, whether it's taking a few deep breaths, repeating a cue word, or doing a rhythmic sequence of movements. Studies on golfing, bowling, and water polo find that short rituals can lead to more consistent and accurate performance under The impact on young Australians who are interested in buying a home of their own has been very significant. Australia's housing affordability now shapes the typical housing cycle, or housing career as some people call it. Most Australians in the normal course of events are people who move through the housing cycle in a way that matches the stages of life that they're at. So, they move out of the family home in their late teens or early 20s as they gain their independence from their families, then they rent to save for a home they can afford as either a group or maybe a couple. And maybe they can upgrade it when they have a family in their middle age. They are more than likely to have paid off their mortgage. And that means they have housing security in their old age. That's no longer the typical housing cycle for Australians. Young people generally live at home for much longer than they once did. They generally rent for longer, and they're more likely to be saddled with a mortgage not just into their middle age but more often than not into their retirement as well. In fact, in 2006, 65,000 retiree households were still paying off the mortgage. Affordable rent is also an elusive right around Australia. We have very low rental vacancies, We see high turnover as landlords want to maximize their profits in a tight market, and we see less long-term or lifelong rental, as we see in other countries and other economies. At the top, you would have a king. Now the king would rule over a kingdom. Now, this is not so easy to govern, especially during the Middle Ages. And the king might owe many people, things, especially people who helped the king come to power, helped him dispose of the previous king or to conquer this land. And so in exchange for that and to help govern, he might grant land or feasts to other people. And the key currency in the Middle Ages under the feudal system, island. And land in exchange for loyalty and service. So this whole thing is a kingdom. Now right over here, this is a duchy. And a duchy will be controlled by a duke. I guess I didn't call it duchy because that just doesn't sound as serious. So the king might grant a duchy to a duke, and in exchange, the duke would provide loyalty, pledge their fealty. If the kingdom is threatened, the duke will fight alongside. The king would provide their own troops if the king wants to go conquer other territories, same thing, and also provide the king with taxes, which might be in the form of coinage depending on what time and region we are in the Middle Ages, or it might be in the form of a percentage of the agricultural production from this duchy. Remember two things. First, I want you to try and remember learning how to ride a bike. Maybe you have a scar you received when you flipped over the handlebars. The next thing I want you to remember is how to ride a bike. The reason I asked you to recall both of these memories is that they belong to two different designated realms of memory. Memory is a fluid and dynamic system that is exceedingly complicated. To this end, psychologists have attempted to divide memory up to make it easier to study. There are two main categories. Explicit memory is a memory that can be intentionally and consciously recalled. This is your memory of riding a bike and falling over the handlebars and skinning your knee. Kindness is very important nowadays. Nature is defined as specific chemical compounds. Students must wear protective clothing provided in the medical laboratory. Physics is a detailed study of matter and energy.